about what I could do 18 years ago. Well, 60s, kind of when everything started going. I was really doing pretty good until about 60, and then I know the knees went out and everything else kind of stuff. I was telling one of the granddaughters in great-grand came to the house next door, and I was telling the boy, he's laughing. I said, sit down there cross-legged and then just demonstrate it. And he did. I said, no, I can do that. Well, your granddaughter can do it. She's sit there cross-legged and just stop that. Oh, yeah. Yeah, me too. Well, I would get up stretched every morning until I started the exercise. I mean, you start trying to get something back. I never would be back. There was a yoga program called Sleep and Sun. It's like 7 or 8 different things. Do it all. I have to skip the biggest part of it. That's all right, you know. If I don't forget, I think I'm still right. We went to the Christian Day, coach there, and I was thinking, we started there 60 years ago. We left there 52 years ago. We left there 58 years ago. It's changed just a tad.
I got quiet. I might not take advantage of that. It's pretty much 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and start. I've asked Bill's going to lead us in a opening prayer, and then we will jump in where we left off 2 weeks ago. So hopefully everybody will remember.
Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we're most thankful that we can gather as your children this evening and take part in this lesson that God has prepared. Lord, we're thankful for this time that we can spend together reflecting upon your word and the things that it teaches us. And Lord, just help us always to take these things and apply them to ourselves as we see you. Lord, thank you for Jesus, and we thank you for him coming to earth and living as a man and ultimately sacrifice and all our behalf. Lord, we pray that we would never take the sacrifice lightly, and we would always remember that this is the Son for us. Lord, thank you again for this gathering.
So we've been talking about the book of Daniel because, if you remember 2 weeks ago, I said that Daniel is one of the most contested books in the Bible. Jonah is the most contested, and Daniel is the second most contested book in the Bible. And the reason for that is a lot of the prophecies that are told in Daniel are pretty detailed, and they came true. So most people that are skeptics of Daniel will say that Daniel didn't write it in 550 BC. It was written by other people much later, in around 160 BC, after most of those events had happened, because there's no way that people could foretell the future. So that's their reasoning behind it. No other reason. And then they start to look for things that say, well, if it was written later, how do we prove that? And I mentioned last time that, one of the things they say is, well, there's Greek words in it. And the Greeks weren't really around in 550 BC, but they were much later. And since there's Greek words in it, then it must have been written later. But there's only 3 Greek words in the entire book. And they're names of musical instruments. And I use the example. We call it a taco because it's a taco, because that's what it was introduced to us. We don't call it a crispy sandwich. We don't Englishize the words. And another reasoning why they think it was written much later is part of it was written in Hebrew and part of it was written in Aramaic. So Hebrew, by the early 100 BCs, 150 or so, was kind of a dead language, like Latin. They still knew it, but nobody really spoke it anymore. And Aramaic was becoming the more common language. But when they look at the Aramaic that it was written in ancient Aramaic, not the common Aramaic from the 160 BC, but Aramaic from the 500s. But we're going to start talking about we've talked a little bit about one of the dreams that Nebuchadnezzar had. And I was getting ready when I was doing this, I wasn't intending to go chapter by chapter, but every single chapter has some really good historic information that has been basically proven that did happen. So I started going chapter by chapter, and we did chapters 1, 2, and 3, and now we're going to jump into chapter 4. And in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. Does anybody remember what that dream is?
That statue?
That was the first dream.
That was the first dream.
So anyway, he has a dream. The first dream, if you remember, he has a dream, but he won't tell anyone what the dream is. Because if you're a really good magician, you'll be able to tell me what the dream is and interpret it for me. And only Daniel was able to do that after he prayed to God about it. Well, this time Nebuchadnezzar is willing to tell the dream. And he wants an interpretation of it. So he calls Daniel in to interpret, and he tells him, here's the dream I had, and it starts in verse 10. He says, these are the visions I saw while lying in bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. In the visions I saw while lying in bed, I looked, and there before me was a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by him. The decision is now announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives to them anyone he wishes, and sets them over the lowliest of people. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me, but you can, because the Spirit of the holy gods is in you. So now Daniel is going to interpret it, but he really doesn't want to interpret it. He God has revealed to him what it means, and he really doesn't want to tell Nebuchadnezzar what it means. It says that Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Belteshazzar answered, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with the beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, producing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in the branches for the birds. Your majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. Your majesty saw a holy one, a messenger coming down from heaven and saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze. in the grass of the field. While its roots remain in the ground, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. This is the interpretation, your majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. Now, skeptics will say that Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years. And skeptics will say that during that 43-year reign, he is so well documented that there is no 7-year gap where he could have gone insane. But that's not necessarily true. His life is very well documented in multiple sources, but there are actually 2 gaps in his history that are long enough where nothing is written about him that this could have happened. So, Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne in 605 BC. His father died. He was out on a campaign. They contacted him, said, you need to come back. Your father has died. You're going to be king now. So in 605, he goes back to Babylon and assumes the throne. The next 10 years of his life are described in both the Bible and various Babylonian records. He shows up in the biblical text in 597 and 586 BC, and he's known through these other Babylonian chronicles, he's known to have had various other exploits during these intervening times that aren't mentioned other than these biblical records. Shortly after Jerusalem's fall in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar begins what is called the Siege of Tyre. And that lasted, it's not like, when they would siege a city, basically the city would close up and they would last as long as they had food and water inside the city. And sometimes that would take years. And the Siege of Tyre lasted from 586 until 573. So that is a 9-year gap. There's nothing else written about Nebuchadnezzar during that 9-year gap. And let me see if I wrote it down yet. So Ezekiel wrote in chapter 26, at the end of this siege of Tyre, Nebuchadnezzar himself defeated Tyre. And Josephus, a Jewish historian from the mid-1st century, around probably 60 AD is when he was writing, he wrote about the conquests by Nebuchadnezzar against Lebanon, Moab, and Ammon that happened in 582. So we know he started the siege of Tyre in 573, and we know that he had this other exploit in 582, but we don't have much written in between. We don't have anything written about Nebuchadnezzar during that time frame. That does not mean there isn't stuff written about him. We just don't have it. And if we do have it on cuneiform tablets, it's never been interpreted yet. And there are a number of uninterpreted, untranslated cuneiform tablets because there's not that many people that can read cuneiform and translate. So it takes a long period of time to get a lot of those done. Some of those tablets that we talked about last week were found in the 1880s, and they were not interpreted until the 1970s. So it's oftentimes 90 to 100 years from the time they find it before they interpret a lot of it. But we have this 9-year gap where we don't have any record. We have a record that he did something in 582, and he did something again in 573. We don't have anything in between. So he could have descended into insanity shortly after the siege of Tyre started. He would have had plenty of time for 7 years of insanity to come to his senses, to clean himself up, and be back at Tyre at the end of the siege and actually be the one that conquers the city. That's highly possible. There is also a 10-year time gap after that siege of Tyre. We don't really have anything written about him after 572 until his death in 562. So that's a 10-year time gap where there's no records in the Babylonian chronicles. There's no biblical history. There's no other history where he's talked about. So we do have two time gaps where he could have had a lengthy period of madness that would have occurred. Now, I feel like Nebuchadnezzar probably descended to madness in this second time gap. And this is my own personal feeling, and the reason that I feel that way is if you look at Daniel 4, 29 and 30, 29 says, 12 months later, this is after he's had a dream, and Nebuchadnezzar, he's had this dream, and Daniel has told him, you need to repent. So easily he could have just had this massive defeat of Tyre. He goes back, he has a dream, he interprets it, gets it interpreted by Daniel. 12 months later, it's now 572. We don't have anything written about him after that. And he could have been feeling pretty proud of himself. You know, I just conquered this city. Took me 9 years to do it, but I did it. He's like 33 years into his 43-year reign. He was known as a builder. He had built the Ishtar Gate. He had built the processional way, the hanging gardens of Babylon. He had done a lot of massive building projects. He had rebuilt the Atimanaki seat or temple that he had built there, the ziggurat. But it says 12 months later, the king was walking on the roof of his royal palace. And then in verse 30, he said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence?" I think he's had a long service of 33 years, and he's feeling pretty cocky and pretty proud of himself. He's looking out over his kingdom saying, look at what I have done. I am pretty great. I am pretty exceptional. And as soon as he said those words is when he ascended into madness. So I just feel like it was probably in this last 10-year time gap that happened, because he had just accomplished some great things. He had just done a lot of building, and suddenly we don't hear anything about him for 10 years. And one archaeological find that I read about, this is Babylonian tablet GM 34113. That's what they call it. It was discovered in Iraq in 1880 by Hormuzd Rassam, but it was not translated until 1975 by a professor named Albert Kirk Grayson at the University of Toronto. So it's 95 years they've had this before it finally gets translated. It is only partial. And when we don't know the date of this particular one because it's only partial inscriptions, but some of the inscriptions, some of the lines are referring to Nebuchadnezzar as having basically a mental breakdown. And one of the lines says, his life appeared of no value to him. Another line says, and the Babylonians speak bad counsel to evil Marduk. Evil Marduk was Nebuchadnezzar's oldest child. So if Nebuchadnezzar was unable to fulfill his duties, his oldest child, evil Marduk, would have stepped in and served as his regent. So it makes sense that if his life appeared of no value to him, that the Babylonians would have gone to him and said, hey, your father is having some trouble. And that's what line 5 seems to indicate, is that the Babylonians are speaking about bad counsel. And evil Marduk is also mentioned. Sometimes he said evil Marduk, sometimes it's Awel Marduk, sometimes it's Abel Marduk, but it's all the same person, just nobody really knows exactly how to pronounce the first part of his name. But he is actually mentioned in 2 Kings 25:27 and Jeremiah 52:31. Another line in this tablet says, then he gives an entirely different order. So he's giving orders, and then he changed his mind. So Nebuchadnezzar's not being consistent with the orders he's giving. The next line says, he does not heed the word from the lips of his courtiers. And then a little bit further down in this tablet, it says, he does not show love to son and daughter. And another line says, family and clan do not exist. So he doesn't seem to recognize or love his children or his family. Something is going on. This tablet indicates something is going on with Nebuchadnezzar, but it doesn't really explain any more of that. And it's only partial. We don't have the full inscription, so we don't know for sure. But it seems to be referring to strange behavior by Nebuchadnezzar. It's been brought to the attention of his oldest son, Evil Marduk, by certain state officials. It seems as though life has lost value to him. He gives contradictory orders. He refuses to accept counsel from his court. And he shows love to neither son nor daughter, and he's neglected his family. He's no longer performing his kingly duties. So something seems to be happening with him. So this tablet describes an episode that is reflected in no other historical document other than Daniel chapter 4. And if you remember, we've talked about it. If you are a king, the last thing you want to do is talk about your failures. So oftentimes failures, when you lose a battle, they don't document that. The enemy who won the battle documents it, but when the Babylonians lose, the Babylonians don't say we lost. They say, hey, we held our own. We didn't take the city, but we kept them pinned up inside. So, the Bible is unique in that it tells all the failures of the Israelite people. But most historical documents do not tell about failures in kingdoms and things. Now, another possibility that I read about, and this one to me is really interesting. There were numerous papyrus scrolls found at the site of Qumran. And if you don't know what Qumran is, that's the city below the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So Qumran is the city. When the Romans were attacking, they think a lot of the scribes took all of those scrolls, went up into the mountains, and hid them in the caves. So that's Qumran is the people who basically were the library that had all of these scrolls was. And so this site, these scrolls date from 3rd century or 2nd century BC. So they're about 300 years older than when Daniel is writing. And that's one of the arguments about why Daniel was not written in 160, because this is around the time the Dead Sea Scrolls would have been written, around 150, 160 BC, and they found multiple copies of the book of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if it was written around 150, there had not been enough time for them to write multiple copies and distribute it all over different religious areas and then still hide them in the cave. So it's more than likely that Daniel was written well before 160, probably written around 550 when Daniel was alive and he actually wrote it. But there were numerous papyrus scrolls that were found, and one cave had 4 scraps of paper, papyrus paper, and these are called 4Q242. Or the common name is the Prayer of Nabonidus. If you don't remember, Nabonidus was actually, we're going to talk about him later, but he was actually Belshazzar. We talked about Belshazzar a little bit already. He was Belshazzar's father. And we'll talk more about him in a little bit, but this Prayer of Nabonidus talks about it's very similar to Daniel 4, talks about a king descending into madness for 7 years, only it attributes it to Nabonidus rather than Nebuchadnezzar. And what the text says, and it was translated by a Harvard professor, Frank Moore Cross, it says, the words of the prayer which Nabonidus, king of Babylon, the great king, prayed when he was stricken with an evil disease by the decree of God in Teman. I, Nabonidus, was stricken with an evil disease for 7 years, and from that time I was like unto a beast, and I prayed to the Most High. And as for my sin, he forgave it. A diviner, who was a Jew of the exiles, came to me and said, recount and record these things in order to give honor and greatness to the name of God Most High. And thus I wrote, I was stricken with an evil disease in Timon by the decree of the Most High, and as for me, 7 years I was praying to gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, and clay, because I was of the opinion that they were gods. So this fragmentary passage is very similar to what's described in Daniel 4, but this fragmentary passage attributes it to King Nabonidus. Now, when we look at Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus, these names do not look similar at all because they've been Englishized. And I don't know why this is over here, but it should be over there. And you can see that, first off, the name Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus both are using a Babylonian god's name, Nabu, in their name. Nebuchadnezzar means Nabu, watch over my heir. Nabonidus means may Nabu be exalted. And if you look at, in Aramaic, the names, they're very, very similar. We don't see it in Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus, but if you look at the Aramaic names, they are extremely similar. And 90 years after Nebuchadnezzar had passed away, a Greek historian named Herodotus went to Babylon. And he read through these records, and he referred to Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus by the same name. He called them Labinitus. So the names in Aramaic were so similar that when the Greek historian saw them, he called them by the exact same name. And it's not impossible to think that 300 years after the fall of the Babylonian Empire, that a scribe in Qumran would have looked at these two names on clay tablets or papyrus scrolls, and they may have been kind of faded, and he misread the name. And he wrote down an account of Nabonidus being sick for 7 years, when in reality it may have actually been Nebuchadnezzar. It's not impossible to make that stretch. I'm not saying that's what happened, but there is some striking evidence between the two names that indicates that it maybe was Nebuchadnezzar that they were writing about and not Nabonidus. There are other scrolls, though, and other clay tablets that do indicate that Nabonidus did suffer a 7-year illness. So, I'm not saying, I don't think the Bible is wrong. I think Daniel got it right. But it's interesting that we have a Babylonian king with a very similar name to Nebuchadnezzar, that it fits the story very, very precisely. Now, from chapter 4, because chapter 4, that was the Nebuchadnezzar going crazy, we move to chapter 5. And we have now switched from King Nebuchadnezzar II to King Belshazzar. Because Daniel 5:1 says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, if you're reading that, you think Nebuchadnezzar died, Belshazzar is king. But that's not what has happened. There's actually a lengthy period of time between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar served for 43 years, and he died in 562. His son, Evil Marduk, Abel Marduk, Awel Marduk, however you're going to say it, he served for 2 years from 562 to 560. But he was considered to be a very bad king. The people didn't like him, the nobles didn't like him, so his uncle, Neriglissar, overthrew him and killed him. More of that family drama that's going on. Neriglissar served for 4 years. He was a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar II. So he had a tie to the Nebuchadnezzar line, which gave him basically claim to the throne. So he was from around August 560 to April 556. His son, he died. His son, Labishai Marduk, then took over. He only reigned for 2 months. He was very young. Some people thought maybe he was a child ruler, but some other records that have come about indicate that he was old enough to take care of his own business. So chances are he was either a very older teenager or a very young 20-year-old. But he was not favored, and Nabonidus overthrew him, killed him, overthrew him, and he took the reign. We don't know for sure, but it's very possible that Nabonidus was also a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar II, and that's how he was able to claim that. Now, Belshazzar is Nabonidus' son. I don't have him listed here, and we'll talk about why in a minute, but it has been at least about 17 years between Daniel chapter 4 and this banquet that's now occurring in Daniel chapter 5. So, for centuries, a lot of skeptics discounted Daniel because in chapter 5 it says Belshazzar was king. There's no record of Belshazzar being king. At least there wasn't for a long time. So for centuries, people said Daniel is a made-up story. There is no King Belshazzar. Everybody knows that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. And in reality, both Nabonidus and Belshazzar were both the last kings of Babylon because they were co-regents and served at the same time. So let's take a look at how that could possibly be. In 1845, they found 4 clay cuneiform cylinders. And if you remember from 2 weeks ago, we said that when a king would build something, they would oftentimes make a clay cylinder, write a bunch of information on it, and bury it at the 4 corners of the building. Well, in one of the cities they dug up, they found 4 of these clay cylinders in the ancient city of Ur, and these are called the Nabonidus cylinders. And they contained inscriptions from King Nabonidus about his eldest son, Belshazzar. So in 1845, we finally had proof, archaeological proof, that Belshazzar actually existed. But until 1845, nobody even knew Belshazzar existed. To date, so far, we actually have about 60 clay tablets and scrolls that support the existence of Belshazzar. So we know he was real. We know he was Nabonidus' eldest son. And we know that he served as co-regent of Babylon along with his father. One article I read indicated that Nabonidus may have made Belshazzar co-regent during his 3rd year of reign. So that would have been in about 553 BC, may have been when Belshazzar actually served as co-regent. Many of the Babylonian records concerning Nabonidus indicate that he spent a lot of time away from the capital city. He was out restoring Babylonian temples and Babylonian pyramids, and honestly, some of the stuff I saw indicated that Nabonidus probably really didn't even want to be king in the first place. And he turned over a lot of these kingly duties to Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was the one who inspected the troops. He was in charge of the army. He did a lot of the things every year for the festivals that the king should have been there doing. And some records have come about that it was actually probably Belshazzar who planned the coup and overthrew Labishai-Marduk. Because other records have indicated that after Labishai-Marduk was killed, Belshazzar actually took over all of his properties, all of his accounts, all of his money, and it seems as though Belshazzar actually had the most to gain by dethroning Labishai-Marduk. So, again, there's a lot more of that political intrigue that's going on and that dysfunctional family stuff that's happening. So, honestly, it's probably that Nabonidus really didn't want to be king. His son probably talked him into being a figurehead. Hey, we're going to overthrow. You'll be the king. I'll take care of everything for you. Don't worry about it. You just go do what you want to do, and I'll take care of it. And, Belshazzar is probably thinking, and after my father dies, I will already be king, and it'll be no problem to ascend the throne. Because If Nabonidus is not the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar II, then he has no royal blood tie to claim the throne. And the people don't like that. They want their king to be of royal blood. So if he really wasn't related to him, then Belshazzar may be thinking, I need to be very kingly so that the people will accept me when my father dies. However, we'll see in just a little bit, here in chapter 5, Daniel calls him King Belshazzar, and he also says that Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's father. And honestly, that's probably similar to all the Israelites saying, our father Abraham. We are all descendants of Abraham. I think that Belshazzar probably is a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So he's making the claim of my father or my grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, saying, look, I have royal blood. I am allowed to be here and hold the throne. So Belshazzar is throwing a large banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and their wives. He's basically showing off. He is saying, let's go get the gold stuff that my grandfather ransacked from the temple in Jerusalem, all the gold plates and cups, and we'll throw a party with the good stuff. Because, we don't worry about that God, and our God is greater, and we'll just throw a party and show how important we are. Look how special I am. I'm the king. I can do anything I want. And as he's doing this, that's where we suddenly get the hand that appears and starts writing on the wall. Meeny, meeny, tekel, parson. And Belshazzar sees this, and he's like, what does this mean? He's in a panic. He doesn't know what it means. He needs someone to tell him. The queen overhears this. The astrologers can't figure it out. Nobody can. When the queen overhears it, she says, hey, there's this guy Daniel, and he can tell you what it means. So Belshazzar summons Daniel, and Daniel comes in, and Belshazzar, in verse 16, he says, or actually, back up just a little bit. That's where we are. In 16, he says, now I have heard that you are able to give interpretation and to solve difficult problems. If you can read the writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. I would always read that and wonder, why the third highest? If the king is the first, who's second? Why is he making him third? And now, understanding that Nabonidus was actually king, he would have been the first highest ruler in the land. His son Belshazzar, as co-regent, would have been second, which means he only had the power to make Daniel third highest. So that makes sense and fits along with the archaeological discoveries and historical discoveries that Belshazzar could only make Daniel the third highest because he couldn't go any higher. So Daniel tells Belshazzar the meaning. Verse 26, he says, here is what these words mean. Meaning, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And that very night, the Medes and Persians snuck into the city, took it without a fight, and Belshazzar was killed. So there are Babylonian records that indicate at the time the Medes and Persians conquered the city, there was a huge festival going on, and that the people were probably distracted by that huge festival and the banquet that's happening at the temple or at the palace. And during that night, the Medes and Persians diverted the water to the river that ran through the center of the city. The water level dropped, and the Medes and Persian army simply marched in the low riverbed into the city and took the city without a fight and killed Belshazzar. We have records that document that that's how the city fell. So, just interesting again that more history and archaeological fits along with what the Bible narrative is telling us. So at the end of Daniel chapter 5, verse 31, it says, new ruler, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And then chapter 6 starts out in verse 1, it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom. Does everybody know what a satrap is? It's basically like a royal governor. Kind of like the king says, I'm going to take 120 of you. You're going to be in charge of this province. You're going to be in charge of that province. You're going to be in charge of that province. And you're all going to be responsible for collecting taxes, upholding order, and making sure that everything runs smoothly for the government, for the royal kingdom. So we have a new ruler. Historically, we have no record of a Persian king named Darius the Mede. But I've said it before, just because we don't have record of something does not mean they did not exist. It may mean that we haven't found the records yet. It may mean that we currently don't understand the records. As I mentioned, there are hundreds of cuneiform tablets, Babylonian tablets, that have never been translated yet. So it's possible that we may still at some point come up with information about a Darius the Mede. So at the end of chapter 6, 28, it says, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus the Persian was Cyrus the Great, and he's the one that is credited with defeating and taking the city of Babylon. However, there is some evidence that suggests the name Darius is not a name but a title, like Caesar or Pharaoh. And that Darius, it's a possibility that Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian are the same person. Because Cyrus is a Persian, but it's thought that he may have also had a Medo mother. So he may have been both Persian and Mede. And he has just recently, not too long, has he been in possession and conquered the Medes and taken over the Medo-Persian Empire. So it may be something where he's saying, he is Darius the Mede, so he has Mede blood to claim I'm also king of the Medes, and I'm Cyrus the Great of the Persian blood, so I have the right to rule the Persians. And there is some evidence that suggests that he may be the same person. It's also possible that Cyrus was king and Darius was appointed by Cyrus to manage Babylon after the takeover. It's generally believed that the reign of Darius the Mede, was only about 10 months. So that would have been a perfect amount of time to basically conquer the city, get everything in order, and then turn it over to Cyrus. So there's a possibility and evidence that he may have just been a temporary person that was assigned by Cyrus the Great to get everything in order before he came in and took over. There's also been a suggestion that there was an individual named Gobryas, and he was commander of the Babylonian forces under Nebuchadnezzar. But he ended up defecting under Belshazzar because Belshazzar had Gobius' son killed. Well, if that's not going to change your loyalties, I don't know what will. But Belshazzar had Gobius' son killed, so Gobius defected, and he went over to the Persians, and he actually led the Persian army into Babylon to conquer the city. So it could be that Gobius, and there is evidence that Gobius was a Mede, had Mede blood in him and was of Mede descent. So they may be saying something like Pharaoh the Mede, or when they say Darius the Mede, it may have been Gobius who was actually temporarily taking control of the city until Cyrus could get there. Now, typically, when you look at the book of Daniel, what's the first story you think about? Daniel in the lion's den, because it has Daniel in the name. I mean, sometimes we might think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but oftentimes when they say the book of Daniel, we immediately think Daniel in the lion's den. So this chapter starts out with a lot more political turmoil. We've seen all through the book of Daniel. Daniel is appointed as one of those 120 satraps, and he is such a good individual. He is blessed by God. He does an amazing job as a provincial governor. So King Darius wants to make Daniel basically the head satrap. I'm going to put you in charge of all of them. Well, all the other satraps don't like that idea because Daniel is not Babylonian. He's, one of the captives from the Jews, and they don't want him to have the power. They want the power themselves. So they conspire against him by going to the king, and verse 4, at this the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And then verse 5, finally these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So they conspire to get him by going to the king, and they're basically, oh, king, you're so great. Everybody should bow down and worship you, and if they don't, you should throw them in the lion's den. And of course at the time, Darius is probably thinking, I conquered this city, and I am pretty great, and people should bow down to me. I'm owed something. So he says, you know what? That's a great idea. Let's make it law. So the king gets the big head, and in the end of verse 12, he says, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So that's one of the interesting things about the historical facts of the writer of Daniel. He knows the difference between Babylonian laws and Medo-Persian laws. Because the king can pretty much do as he pleases, right? He's the king. Who's going to tell him he can't? And that was how the Babylonian law was. The Babylonian king could make decrees, and if he didn't like it, he could change it. If he made a decree, so what? I'm king. It doesn't apply to me. But when the Medes and the Persians made a law and wrote it down, it was binding. Even the king could not break that law. And if he did, he could be punished for breaking his own law. Now, if he didn't like it, he could write another decree to change it. But when the king wrote something down, it became law even for him. And that basically said, in the Persian government, even the king is not above the law. And the writer of Daniel understands that. So when he's writing about this, he knows that that is significant difference between the Persians and what he had been previously under the Babylonians. He knows that it needs to be said, the Persians write it down and the king can't change it. So archaeological digs have also uncovered enclosed animal pits at the palace, the Babylonian palace. And these are pits that have no windows, no doors, and it is pretty much believed they were there to keep wild animals. And that lions were oftentimes kept by the king, and occasionally they would release one, and the king and his entourage would go out and hunt it. And the king would take a spear and give the final blow to say, look how great I am, I can kill a lion. Even though all the others had run it to ground, and he just took the final stab at it. So we know that that they kept lions. Lions in the Babylonian Empire were also considered to be a sign of power. There are lion motifs on the Ishtar Gate that Nebuchadnezzar built. There are lion motifs on some of the boundary markers all around Babylon. And there are lion motifs down the processional way that was built by Nebuchadnezzar. So lions were a pretty important part of Babylonian and even later in Persian. I don't know if this is really factual, but I had read some stuff that the Persians were under a religion called Zostar, and they did not believe in burying their dead. So oftentimes they would feed the dead bodies to wild animals. And that may have been why they had a lion's den, is that they were throwing the kingly bodies to be devoured by a lion. Because by burying the body, it would contaminate the purity of the earth, is one of the beliefs I had read about. I don't know if that's true or not, but still kind of interesting. You know the rest of the story. Daniel is caught worshiping God, so the king wrote his law. He has no choice. He has to throw Daniel in the lion's den. He's distraught over it. But God shuts the mouths of the lions, saves Daniel. King has Daniel removed from the lion's den the next morning. And then he has all of the conspirators and their families rounded up and thrown into the lion's den. And it says that even before they hit the ground, the lions devoured them. So then King Darius issues another decree. In verse 25, then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, I wish I had archaeological documents that said Daniel, one of the head satraps, was thrown into a lion's den. I don't have that. Does not mean that one of those clay tablets that's never been translated isn't going to say that, but we don't actually have any of that documentation. We do have some documentation of people being thrown in lions' dens and killed by wild animals, so, but it would be nice if we had the smoking gun that said Daniel was thrown into a lion's den, but we just don't have that. So then we come to chapter 7. We actually go back in time a little ways, because verse 1 tells us it was the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And we know that the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon in his final year. And his father reigned for 17 years, and he may have been co-regent for 14 of those years. So chapter 6 is at the end of his reign, and now we back up to his first year. So we're actually probably backing up about 14 years before the fall of the Babylonian Empire. In Daniel's dream, he has a dream in chapter 7. It's basically the same prophetic dream that Nebuchadnezzar had about the statue, only Nebuchadnezzar didn't have it. Now Daniel's having it, and it's not a statue, it's beasts, but it basically means the same thing. So instead of a statue of 4 different materials, Daniel dreams of 4 different beasts. Instead of the gold head that Nebuchadnezzar saw, Daniel sees a lion that has the wings of an eagle, and it represents the kingdom of Babylon. Instead of the silver chest and arms, Daniel sees a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth. It represents the Medo-Persian Empire. Instead of the bronze waist, Daniel sees a leopard with 4 wings like birds and 4 heads that represents a unified Greek empire that is then later split into 4 Greek kingdoms. And that's documented that it happened. So instead of legs of iron with feet mixed with clay and iron, Daniel sees a terrifying, powerful beast with iron teeth and 10 horns, similar to the 10 toes on the statue that are talked about. And that represents the Roman Empire, which is later divided into... I did read some stuff that said the Western Roman Empire was divided into about 10 kingdoms. And that is one of the thoughts between the 10 toes and the 10 horns, is that one of them was that it was divided amongst them. So Daniel's dream goes a little bit deeper than Nebuchadnezzar's dream, because from the 10 horns, a smaller horn comes up. It is shrewd, boastful, and harmful to God's people. The smaller horn most likely represents a ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And we're going to see another dream about him later that it'll kind of tie in. But in later verses of Daniel's dream, we see that God, the Ancient of Days, destroys the beast with the small horn, and the Son of Man is given authority over all creation, and his kingdom will never be destroyed. That sounds an awful lot like the rest of the Bible, especially the New Testament, that the Son of Man is going to establish a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Now, other than the fact that these prophecies were fulfilled centuries after they were foretold, we don't have any other archaeological evidence that supports them. We have a document that was written around 550 BC that tells about these coming empires. And, we backed up 11 years from the fall. So this is 11 years before the before Babylon is taken out by the Persians. And Daniel is seeing that this is going to happen. At this time, when this is written, a Greek kingdom doesn't even exist. There are some Greek city-states that are fighting amongst themselves. They are not any kind of superpower. They have no power at all. It's not till 300 years later that they become a unified Greek kingdom. And about 32 years after that is when it breaks apart into the four kingdoms. And then later, the Roman Empire comes in and wipes out everybody. Destroys all the former kingdoms, takes over everything. They are hard to defeat like iron. But they're a weak group of people as far as cohesion by culture. So eventually, all these other kingdoms rebel and they split into multiple kingdoms, and the Roman Empire is gone as well. And from one of these Greek empires, there is a ruler, the small horn, who comes up and takes over. And we'll look, when we get into chapter 11 about the army, the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south, it'll really detail this little horn and what he did. And it was, like I said, it was most likely Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And we'll talk a lot more about that later. But so we have that. This is the main reason that skeptics say Daniel had to be written in the 160 BC. Because there is no way that someone from 550 BC knew this was going to happen and could foretell it was going to happen unless there's a real God who guided him in understanding it and revealed it to him. So if it was written in 550, then a real God had to have a hand in making this understandable and happen. So we're going to end up doing one more day on Daniel. So any questions? Because I'm going to stop there. We're going to move into chapter 8, which is really going to talk a lot about the Greek Empire. And it's another dream that Daniel has. It goes into a lot of detail that is only prophetic foreknowledge. And that's the only way it could be known, is that God revealed it to him. And we'll look at the history that supports it. But any questions at all about what we've covered so far, or last 2 weeks? We have after today, we have 2 more weeks. And then Buck's going to be teaching, so over Revelations. I think it's going to be interesting.
Is there any indication or any confirmation between the writing of Daniel and the apocryphal Daniel, Bell, and the serpent? Is there anything that connects them at all?
I've not come across stuff yet.
So that is pretty well considered a fact.
Some of the stuff, we don't have the Maccabee books in our Bible, but some of the stuff is written that we'll talk about next time is written by the Maccabeans. Historical things that happened, but they're corroborated through other sources as well.
Some of them sound pretty far-fetched, but that one, could be, I guess.
I'm still working on Daniel 10, 11, and 12, because those are really hard. There's a lot of interpretation on those. Some people think they haven't happened yet. Some people think they have. I'm really not finding a ton of information, so I'm looking, but I'm still working on 9, 10, and 11. But I don't know how deep I'll go into them because there's not a lot of supporting evidence. There is for 11. There's a lot of good stuff on 11, and we'll talk about the 770s in chapter 9, and I think we'll get through it next week. So we'll see. If you don't have any questions, that's all I've got, at least for today.
I have a question.
Yep.
You talked about some of those scrolls, the old scrolls that were found have not been translated.
Yep.
Why?
Because there are very, very few people that can read ancient Sumerian and can read cuneiform. So unless it pertains to their research, they're just sitting in warehouses waiting to be translated because there's very few people that can do it. So people that are translating it are the ones who are, I need to translate this because it fits within the research I'm doing. And they take a long time to do. Because a lot, clay tablets, they get scuffed, scratched, broken, and you're like, is that a 0 or an O? And they're and it takes a while to figure it all out.